All right. Hello, RP Plus members. This is Dr. Jacob Reed bringing you the third lecture in the series on athlete monitoring. In the first two, we covered the why and then the how of how we're actually going to collect it. And then this time, we're actually getting into some data interpretation. So just a quick review of the last lecture. Really what we're trying to do with athlete monitoring is measuring a cause and effect. Now we can do that through multiple parameters. And so the cause, remember, being something like training volume, some sort of stressor like midterms, family issues, both in the positive and in anything that's good as well. That is a cause. It's going to result in some sort of effect. The effects that we're trying to measure are going to be varied, and hopefully we have enough to get an idea of the grand scheme. So having a little bit of physiological, a little bit of psychological, and then maybe some outcome measures will give us a decent idea of what's truly happening. And the things that we can look at are stuff like training volume, certain wellness parameters, performance testing, and outcome measures, as well as a litany of technologies. And then even in the previous video, I felt like I could have gone on forever talking about those, but it's something that's always evolving. And as long as we keep in mind our thought process of the validity and the reliability, we can always be certain that if it's there, that it's probably a good piece of technology. So, how to interpret the data? This is a very interesting realm in that in its initial phases of athlete monitoring, it was kind of here's just a simple graph. Go with it. And decisions were being made. I remember when I first started at Texas A&M in 2014. The technology had been incorporated into various institutions, and there were a couple articles that would come out and said, well, if a certain player hits a certain amount of load, which we talked about in the last video, where load being the total amount of work or volume they did, they would pull them from practice and tell them to stop. And that was it. Just done for the day. In a position like a quarterback, that becomes a big deal. Well, in that same team, it didn't work out so well for the head coach by the end of the season. So we really do have to be mindful of how we're interpreting this stuff, because the last thing you want to do is to interpret something wrong. Now, we'll never be 100% certain of our interpretations, but we can at least do some things to ensure that, or to increase the likelihood that what we're saying is true. That and along those lines goes with communication. And it's here that I'm going to start talking about how we actually talk to people. And if you want the TLDR, don't be a dick. And you'll be pretty successful in this field. Okay, so now when we're looking at visualization, there are some things that we have to really be aware of. First off being how we're going to determine change, especially meaningful change. Now, I talked a little bit about smallest worthwhile change in terms of test-retest, where we have an idea of the expected error in the test. Maybe it's this big, and then in the next testing session, maybe they get a little bit better, but it's still within the error, or it looks like they got better and it's within the error. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that they actually had some sort of improvement. So it was with the example where we had the range of 1.26 to 1.46 on the 10-yard sprint. On the pre-test, maybe they had a 1.36 as their average. The post-test, maybe they're were the 1.46 as their average, or a 1.4 or a 1.38. Does that mean they got worse? Well, not if the error, it's still within the error. But if their improvement or lack of improvement got outside that error range, being the 1.46 or the 1.26, then maybe, yeah, there actually was some meaningful improvement. But we also have other ways to look at change. That's just test-retest. With humans being the way we are quite variable day to day. I don't think anybody's going to argue with me on that one. And because of that, we have to be aware of that issue, in that what we see one day is going to be might be totally different the next. But that also just might be normal because of who we are and our internal physiology. So what we have to be able to do is to measure special cause change, meaning something that has happened that is beyond the normal expectations of normal day-to-day variation. And that's where it really becomes important when determining change. So you're not that team that's pulling a guy for no reason other than you guessed a value is actually high or not. I've even heard of other scenarios where there'd be people running this technology on the sidelines in games, in games, but primarily in practice, where they'd say, okay, X person is hitting a certain amount of speed, let's pull them, or they're slowing down or something along those lines. Well, something to be aware of in football is that there's a lot more going on. So for example, when we had the first game I ever measured, we had a defensive back that ran 22 miles an hour. And you think, holy cow, that's amazing. That's super fast. Well, it was because he got burnt. He literally there was a receiver flying by and he was trying to catch them. So is 22 miles an hour really, A, is it positive? And B, is that something we actually want to be able to look at? And if the next game they don't hit 22, maybe they only hit 18. Well, what if the receiver only ran 18 miles an hour and they're stuck to him like glue? To me, that's a positive thing. So we do have to be aware of what is truly meaningful, especially within the context of sport and the individual sports especially. With this visualization, we have various ways that we can actually go about it in the forms of graphs, charts, and dashboards. So if we look at this determining change, you'll see two graphics here. Now, all this data that I'm about to present to you, I totally made up. I made an Excel spreadsheet. I clicked equals range between intelligent values. So like, I think it was 4 to 10 hours a day of sleep, I think for this example of sleep duration, and it just filled it in for me. So just bear in mind, this is just fake made up stuff, but it actually worked out really well. So if we're going to determine change, we need to be able to look at the meaningfulness. So on the graph on the left, you see weekly sleep duration. This is for both of them. Now, what we see is that this is just sum of sleep duration, that on day or on week 1, the individual is at 50 hours of sleep, and then it actually trended downward for over the course of 5 weeks. And you may look at that and think, that's probably pretty bad, especially if they're going down to 40. Well, 40 hours and they're sleeping 7 hours, well, they're getting a little less than 6 hours a day on average. Not totally outside the realm. It's obviously a little bit less than what we expect, but it's not also that bad. But here's the kicker. When we look at the graph on the right, there are 2 lines that are above and below. We call these upper and lower control limits. Now, this data is actually made by averaging a specific time period. So generally speaking, if I'm trying to get an idea of what's normal, which is what we want, we don't want a scenario where the crazy things are happening. We just want an idea of what's normal. And then we take the week's data and we average it to get a total number of hours of sleep per week. So in this scenario, I averaged, I think it was the first 5 weeks, I believe, or 4. Or if we're doing daily averages, we'll average throughout every day in the week. Well, once we do that, we have an idea of the average. Cool, awesome. But then we get the standard deviation of that same time period, same metrics, and then we multiply it by some value. Now, this is based on the bell curve, where if we get two standard deviations outside of the norm on a bell curve, we're looking at 95% of normal of data should exist 2 standard deviations outside of average. We get 3 standard deviations, we're at 99.7%. 1, I believe, is 67 or something, 68, something along those lines. Personally, I like to use 1.5, and here's why. Just historically, when I've used 2, it creates a very large range, because these ranges, you imagine it's taking the average and the standard deviation of a normal week. We're essentially, if we do 2 standard deviations, saying that anything that lies within these values is considered normal. And so once values start to trend outward or even get out, we can start to have an idea that, hey, maybe these things aren't quite normal, that we might actually have some special cause change occurring. And it's at that point that can be confident that, hey, something actually might be going on here. Whereas if we look at the graph on the left, it's telling us, and it's a downward trend, it's super obvious downward trend, that, well, it looks like something bad's happening. But then we go to the right and we recognize, oh, that's just their normal variation. Now, I would say in this specific scenario, they are still trending down. I would probably still go to the individual and say, hey, how's your sleep going? What's happening there? Maybe you find out that homework's becoming very tough, or that maybe they switched to going to the early training session. Instead of maybe being at the 11 a.m., they went to the 6 a.m. or the 5:45 a.m., and now their sleep's decreasing, which, FYI, later training sessions, especially for college athletes, it's a better idea in terms of getting the most sleep. So I would still have that conversation, but I wouldn't be freaking out about it. And I at least know that when I go to have that conversation, I'm not going in with worry or with extreme concern. It's, hey, casual conversation. How are things going? What do you think? So, we're seeing a little bit of trending in your sleep going down. Nothing crazy, but just kind of curious to see if there's anything we can do to help you to get that sleep better. And they say, oh, I decided to go to the early morning training session because my buddies are there. It's like, well, look, man, is your training important and is your recovery important? Well, absolutely. Well, maybe you should go to the 11 a.m. then, because you're obviously not getting the sleep. And if you're not getting the sleep, you're not getting the recovery that we're looking for. And eventually that's going to lead to a lack of adaptation or even maladaptation, potentially resulting in decreased performance, injury, or anything bad. But this is how we can determine change. Now, what I just described in terms of creating these limits, they're called control limits. It's used actually in machining. If anybody's ever heard of Six Sigma, that's what it is. When we're making ball bearings, they need very tight regulations to ensure that the ball bearings are the same size. And they'll go out to 6 standard deviations. Us being humans, it's okay to have 1.5 or 2. There's other ways to do this, though. There's multiple approaches that people have taken. You can use things like coefficient of variation, which is the standard deviation divided by the average times 100 of that same time period to see percent changes. You can use things like a z-score as well. Obviously, it's another statistical process, but there are various approaches that some people prefer over others. Statistical process control is the one I've just described. It's my personal favorite because it's super easy to get in Excel. Average, standard deviation, that's it. So Excel provides us this opportunity, and I use Excel because it's free and it's available to me, that I don't have to have any cost or anything like that. So key point being that we need to be able to determine meaningful change. And continuing with this sleep, if I were to extend it out, maybe let's say that I saw that a week 6, 7, 8, that it kept trending downward, that there was even less sleep accumulated each week. I would actually probably have a little bit more serious conversation about that. And then it might warrant bringing in a professional. Because when you see this kind of information and you're talking about things like some psychological parameters, potentially depression, things with body weight can lead to female athlete triad, body dysmorphia, anything along those lines. There's serious considerations and things that we have to be aware of. And so in our position, we have to know where our scope of practice ends. This can help us at least say, hey, you know what? I've tried when things didn't seem to be that bad to help. It's starting to get worse, but it's not to the point where it's super concerning. But obviously my approach hasn't worked. Now let's bring in a professional. And it helps you make that correct decision to help the person. That's really what we're here for, is to help them stay healthy, try to be happy, perform well, learn life lessons, and then hopefully accomplish their goals. One other thing to mention with this, when I use the statistical process control, I will look for, if I see that we're trending up, like I've described, it might pique my interest. Maybe if I see one data point outside of the control limits, it also might pique my interest. And I might look at it and say, oh, hey, that's interesting, and nothing else. But as soon as I start to see that maybe 2 days, now it's starting to increase out, and then 3 days, that it's still trending out and we're not seeing any sort of positive change, that's the point when I would say, hey, you know what? I think we might need to make some action, to have some sort of action evident. Especially if, say if it's just sleep duration and everything else looks good, maybe I'll say something, maybe I'll talk to my colleagues and see what they're interested in. But if I start to see that not only is sleep duration decreasing, continues consistently below the norm, what's expected norm, that fatigue is increasing, resting heart rate's increasing, body weight's decreasing, and then their performance everywhere else is going down, well, guess what? I should probably go out and have a conversation with the relevant parties to get this person back on track. So you'll notice that I never make a decision, and nobody should make a decision based on one thing. We're always using all of our tools to be able to help us answer the question and to make the right decision. So next up are graphs. Now, graphs are probably one of the easiest ways to make a decision, to actually see what's going on. There's Napoleon's march to Moscow, I believe. Historical, beautiful graphic depicting a ton of information. What it is, it actually showed his change over time, like his size of his army over time, the temperature, rivers that they traveled through, what happened to their army. Like part of them left halfway through. By the time he got to Moscow, his army was almost gone, not almost gone, but he had lost a significant portion, and it was super cold. Turned around, came back, hit a river, lost almost, I think everybody but 10,000 troops, and then barely made it back with almost nobody, all in one simple graphic. The point being that we can use these to take a lot of information and condense it into a really easy to understand manner. So in the graph that you see here, I just took a screenshot of the demonstration database that I had developed and the dashboard. And you can see that when I talk about how trends happen over time and that how I like to use multiple components, well, this is where I'm going to go. So like if I saw the sleep, well, I'm also going to be seeing the rest of these at the same time. So I might see anxiety, how it's trending. I might see desire to train, what's happening there. With these graphics, nothing really important. If we look at weekly session RPE, it's interesting. Week 2, it was almost right at the top, and then it dropped. Not below the normal, but it still dropped. Sleep duration also decreased, and then training duration had a slight decrease as well. Well, we have to remember that session RPE, training load, and training duration are related. Like training duration is a component of session RPE training load. So we expect those to have a little bit of an ebb and a flow together. But this is a way for us to take a lot of data and condense it into one area. Because with this, especially the bar graphs that are listed, they're everything showing 1 week of the 3 bar graphs. It's a sum of those values each week. It's a lot of information actually that's been condensed into one to help tell the story. Whereas if we start looking at desire to train and anxiety, that's actually each day of the same period. So it gives us 2 different looks at really what's going on. And if you were to scroll up, you would be able to see the daily training load, the daily sleep. Maybe you find that if you're looking, you see that sleep duration's decreasing on the weekly sum, and then you go to the daily and you find out that, oh, look, it happens to all be on Thursday. Well, I think Thirsty Thursday is a thing that happens to a lot of different places. Maybe that's what's happening. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's a study group goes long. Who knows? But it can tell you a little bit of nuance, a little bit of detail that is going to help you in the decision-making process. After the graphs, we have the ability to actually use charts. Now, with the way that the charts work, especially this one, it allows us to take not only that large amount of information that we see from the graphs, but it also takes multiple people as well. So here you say notice myself and Dr. Hoffman are my 2 dummy people in this chart. And the way I've designed it, I call it a quick check. Because you can imagine, if you have 50 people, it's going to take a lot of your time to look at every single one of those graphs to see if something is out of the norm. Which, let's be honest, we don't necessarily have time for that. So what do we do? Well, these charts can actually help us along the way. And so what you see is both of our names, obviously. There's a date range up top. So this is January 8th, January 1st through January 8th. So it's this, whatever week it is. Typically, I like to look at the current week, or the previous, actually. Then our eyes are drawn to the color coding system. Now, red, yellow, green stoplight used very frequently in athlete monitoring, and it's useful. People understand it. So when we see this, every single column is one of our metrics that we're assessing. Now, the values that are associated with each column are a count of the number of days that are either above or below the control limits that I described when we were determining change. Now, I say above or below because it depends on what's relevant. Like if I have sleep that is above the norm, I'm not as concerned as I am to sleep that's below the norm, sleep duration especially. Same with sleep quality, which, as we talked about in the last lecture, would be something like insomnia, the inability to fall and stay asleep. If that decreases, that's also something that I would be aware of. But when we see this, it adds a lot of context. So I can look at myself, for example. Again, this is just fake data. But I have 4 days that during the week, or I had 4 metrics during the week that were all above my norm. Just one day though. And I had another one, my sleep duration, that was actually 2 days below the norm. Is that warranting some sort of conversation? Probably not, honestly. Because there's 7 days in a week, and I'm only 1 out of the norm. That's like normal human variation. Whereas if we look at James, he only had 2. He's good. But let's imagine that for mine, instead of those 1s, maybe it's 3s and 4s. Then that might actually catch my eye. Now I have 5 different metrics that are all popping off on 3 to 4 days, like I had mentioned earlier, above the norm. That's going to give me a lot of power to suggest that, hey, something is going on, and I should probably have a conversation with someone to see if it's meant to be happening and what kind of change is already being done, if need be, or if it's happening, or what we should do to ensure that these get back to normal, if we deem that they should be, of course. Whereas if we look at James, let's assume that his there's 2 of them, or 3 of them. So those 2 that are at once, let's say that now there's 3 days. Well, it's 3 days of the week he was training hard, harder than normal. Okay, that's kind of interesting. I might have a conversation and say, hey, I was training last week. Oh, it was kind of hard, but I feel good now. All right. Or maybe he says I was feeling sick. That's actually often common, where we see some sickness. Typically speaking, though, sickness is associated with an increase in resting heart rate, which obviously he didn't have. But sickness might be something you want to actually look at. But you can then see how this kind of information helps to condense a lot of our huge amount of info into something that allows us to direct our assessment. Because what I would then do from this point is I would go to my graphs and look at me specifically. And not only me specifically, but those individual metrics. And then I would determine, okay, the trends make sense. And, maybe something, the other ones that didn't necessarily pop off, maybe they're trending toward out of the norm as well. Now I have power to be able to actually say, hey, something's happening. Interesting note, I had this happen when I was working at Texas A&M. There was an individual who was not exactly playing a whole lot. And in practice was just getting normal repetitions. They were, 3rd, I think, in line. And then in the middle of the season, they had the couple of their position colleagues got hurt, and that individual was brought up to the first string. Well, what do you think happened to their training volume? It went like from this, a process shift up, across. We saw a huge shift. So not only outside of the norm of expectations of work, but also consistently. And on top of that, it was a steep increase. It was an immediate increase, obviously. Because if injuries happen in a game, it means on Monday, guess what? Now you're in the start instead of a gradual. Well, unfortunately for that individual, I saw it. I said, hey, look, I talked to a few people. I said, probably should be mindful about this person moving forward, just to be aware. And they said, okay, thank you. We'll keep that in mind. Nothing changed, which is okay. I totally understand that because at the time I was a 27-year-old kid with my PhD, and I was talking to SEC coaches and personnel. So yes, I was in a position and I was hired to do my job, but it was also one of those things where it's like you have to earn your keep. And so with that being said, I only talked about 2 things that fall that I was very confident that were going to be meaningful. And both times I spoke, I was right. That is incredibly crucial because after that, what do you think happened? They knew that if I were to ever say anything about monitoring, that, hey, we probably should be mindful of this, that I'm not lying and that I have a history of being right. So I've developed my own credibility. And although I couldn't help the individual, hopefully I would have been able to help others in the future. So as you're going through this, you have to do that as well. You can't just be making knee-jerk reactions and saying everything's bad. Goodbye credibility. You turn into the boy who cried wolf. By using statistical process control in these charts and visualizations, we're able to be very confident and make very specific recommendations to ensure that we're right, we gain our credibility, and that we help the people that we're trying to help. Dashboards, kind of the last thing. It's tying together all of it. Here you see an example of the one I did. This is in Excel. I made it on my own. It took me 2 hours to make this thing. Not too bad. For me anyway. It's what I do. I hope at some point to be able to create a lecture series just on how to do this for all of you. But in the meantime, we're going to have to settle with this is what you could do. But it's doable in Excel. In the last lecture series, I showed you how I designed my tables. Those tables allowed me to create these visualizations so that I could then select the individual easily. As soon as I select the individual, all the graphs change to be relevant to each person. As soon as I select the date range, the date changes, the range changes to that specific area that I'm looking for. And typically speaking, dashboards, they come in all shapes and sizes. There are ones that you can, softwares that you can go out and buy. There's online versions out there. There's a lot of opportunity, but the point I want to get across here is that you don't have to spend a lot of money. I think in the last 2 lectures, that's been my point. You can do good athlete monitoring and spend nothing other than a little bit of time developing the trust with the athletes and coaches, and then spending a little bit of time learning how to do your own data management, which actually isn't too bad, but it does take that approach. But you can see here with the dashboards how easy it is to actually see that ebb and the flow during the days. And then to know that, oh, yes, we had a few spikes here and there, but overall, things look pretty normal. So, I know the last thing I want to cover is communication. And if you think back on the way that I've been speaking in this entire presentation, it's that after every time I see the data and I decide, hey, I should probably make a decision, or it might be warranted to do something, I always go talk to someone. Every single time I go and talk to a colleague, I go and talk to a coach. It doesn't really matter who, as long as it's somebody in the realm of where that maybe has an idea. Maybe they have more insight than you do on that person. The athletic training staff, holy cow, they're with them all the time. So is the strength and conditioning staff, so are the coaches. You can go and talk. Check your ego at the door. In athlete monitoring, there's this, in the high performance model, there's this theme where we're trying to get rid of silos. Silos being these realms, athletic training, sports medicine. Strength conditioning, coaches, sports psychology, they have their own little silos of knowledge where everybody's all happy and they all are trying to get out everything and help the individual. Well, if those silos aren't connected, we end up at everybody, one, isn't communicating back and forth. So we might have athletic training and strength conditioning that are trying to do the same thing through two different ways and adding on a bunch of information or a bunch of load to the athlete that they might not be aware of. Or maybe sports nutrition is doing something that doesn't exactly go hand in hand with strength conditioning. For example, if you have a massing phase or a hypertrophy phase and sports nutrition is like, okay, it's time to cut. Guess what? Goodbye massing phase. That communication has to be there. So if we can connect those silos and have kind of a round table, King Arthur, Knights of the Round Table, everybody's equal discussion. Let's share our knowledge for the collective good. Not only are we doing that, we're making sure that everybody's using their own time effectively from a staff and the athlete standpoint, but we're also making sure that the plan and the process is the best that it can be based on the collective knowledge base. So when I say check your ego at the door, that's literally what I'm getting at, is that you may know a lot in your respective field, and that's great. And you may have an idea of the others, which is actually even better. Because then you can start to communicate with everybody in the realm, and they can help you learn more. And then you can actually start to say, hey, man, what if I do this instead? For example, when I was doing strength conditioning with volleyball, I would communicate with the athletic trainer. And I would say, hey, I noticed that the athletes are coming in and doing some prehab stuff. Is there anything that I can do to, in my weight training session to help so that they're not coming into you for 10 to 15 minutes and that they're actually getting what you're looking for? And she was like, actually, yeah, we could do XYZ. I was like, that's awesome. It took 5 minutes, 10 minutes out of my training session that I had otherwise had available or that I could make available. Because then it created a relationship with the AT staff to know that I was helping them. And then the athletes are all getting their work done in one spot. So it really does become checking your ego at the door and understanding your role and what you're supposed to be doing. That you're there to support not only the athlete, but the staff. In order to do that well, be friendly. Don't be a dick. And always be willing to listen to other people and just be nice. Speaking to athletes is an incredibly important task. Helping to ensure that they know, hey, look, I'm on your same page. I'm trying to help you. Make sure that you stay healthy and that you're performing at your best. None of this stuff gets hung over your head. It's so powerful in the success of any athlete monitoring program. Because if you don't have it and you don't have the trust, you don't have the buy-in from staff, athletes, doesn't matter. It's worthless. And then lastly is KISS. I threw out the last S because I don't like it, but keep it simple. And by that, I mean, one, you have a time component. You're only going to convince somebody of something in a very short amount of time. So you better have your visuals and your verbal communication ready to go and quick and very specific. So you say, hey, I think we should do this because of this. And this is why. And the coaches and athletes are usually like, okay, I get it. Let's go. Awesome. Time has been well spent. That can get into something like a 1-page versus an 80-page report. An 80-page report is kind of interesting. When I was working at A&M, we were fortunate enough to be able to go and listen to a bunch of presentations from other college and NFL teams. One of the NFL teams would give an 80-page report each week to the head coach on each individual. Now, I don't know about you, but if you have the time to go over an 80-page report on something that the magnitude of effect is, it's there, but it's not like at the top of the list, I might not be using my time effectively. When I was working with volleyball, I had 2 years worth of data, and I synthesized it into a front and back sheet of paper. 3 bullet points on the back and 1 graph on the front to demonstrate the points that I was trying to make based on the questions that we had to ask or that we had asked. By keeping it that simple and condensing this information down, It makes the decision-making process easier, and you can be a lot more confident in that process as well. So that's all I have for this lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. A little bit shorter than the others, but I look forward to talking to you next time. Thanks.